One Final Prayer. 70, Ely James, Our Rights Reserve, 2023. Run. Run. The report is true. It is true. The Father Michael Sebastian D'Angelo breathlessly exclaimed, he's far from our prophet and pope with religious revival in his wings. And only believed to be still in the blessed basilica to go down with the ship and suffer the grim fate as though ordained by God, I think. But by the despotic Satan and traitor Nasser Hussein is he motivated. God forgive us the terrible, terrible sacrilege. His prophet was something other than our hope as to Eleazar and Padre Pieter Drome Darnus we turned. Imposter, both of them. And we are to be blamed alone. And now this as she does burn as does DC in the portions of very world. We've partnered with him, the infamous one empowered by Satan himself. We were, many of us to whom the world looked for an answer, deceived. The Father Michael Sebastian D'Angelo alongside several cardinals to his either side was similarly coming undone, both in attire and emotion. Clothing appendages intertwined in fabric blossomed loose and ricocheted and skidded across pavement, getting caught between persons scampering feet and legs. One of same cardinals on wheels and zippering down pavement thanks to the man feverishly pushing him in the wheelchair with a distraught young woman falling into and then careening coarsely off of same chair, angularly to the ground sent as pandemonium divisible only by other forms of chaotic madness was for the moment the generous yet unforgiving air. As the ground shook something terrible beneath their feet, the statue figures of notable and stately antiquity like sentinel guards aligning the high overhead rims and rows of building all leading to Vatican Square dislodged and as though in slow motion tipped and then toppled into cement and marble shambles aligning the cobblestone street. Only, as Lord knows, my later misgivings greatly troubling me, continued the priest as though both beleaguered and eager to in defiance of his hyperventilating bout speak, stealing an eclipsed breath with chest cavity thrusting forward, and, thoroughly prevented my very sleep for many a night on end. I petitioned God, asking for assistance and he sent me dreams that I did misconstrue as fiery brands shot at me from Satan himself. She in Vatican City is in fact bombed. Oh God, do save us. The many have lost even the will to cling on to their own strength and your planet is sunken under the weight of our own despair. Nothing remains. Only the demand to either surrender to or painfully resist death with only that as motive. Mortar blasts were the warning sounds given as the so-called little fires of Rome, pillars like dominoes slamming against each other before the rock constructs littered the ground with frolicking specks of destitution alive in dust plumes with night lights. Nature's and those artificial. Reflecting inside of that variety of granite that wonderfully shines when touched by sunshine glints of splaying light. Similarly emitted were sparks of almost phosphorescent glimmer and the reflective particles changed course when the winds from another explosion rocked the columns nearby as had just a short distance away a substantial portion of the magnificent Colosseum quit being rattled that was 1/4 set ablaze. Two jets swiftly streamlined on unaccountably hostile trajectory into her cranked open ornate mouth, shot down like lightning strikes into the bosom as though the construct was waiting and anticipating their rapid descent. Persons during a visit against advice took to their heels, as tirelessly occurs during traumatic experiences that does ever and time again serve like green lights to vehicles when compelled persons approach only to with wounded astonishment wonder rather than fleeing from obvious signs of danger. Security personnel, police officers and rescue teams chastised the same individuals and warned that the bombings only precede these as was that characteristic in Washington, D.C., USA. The bombings only precede the greater attacks against the Vatican Square and all surrounding and the conglomerate forces, a mad throng bolted riotously around a corner. Hey! Get the hell out of there! You are not in the clear! Hey! Hey! He forced his fist into the air, tightly whirled it around at the end of his arm while indicating the throne with a fiercely pointing left hand. Listen for yourselves. Mortar blasts are en route to light up that entire area. Can't you see and hear them storming away from trajectory paths up there? Nasser and your Padre Pieter have expressly taken responsibility and have acted on their threat to because of the broken alliance annihilate the city entire. I'm warning you. Get the hell out of here. You've seen what's happened. As though bent and determined to finally unclog a portion of brain wherein was housed inhibition and great slack in reservation he instead of chewing and lunging forward more determinedly backpedaled slowly and while tracing his fingers against the cold steel holstered at his either side, last seconds of an Old West standoff with an enemy unseen. Listen to me. He shouted, feeling the barking strain in his neck and against the side of his head. Proceed to the square and you will be forcefully, he paused to take notice of persons curiously watching him instead of like the throng taking to their heels, you will be forcefully removed. This is your warning. The police officer shouted over his shoulders as though to compete with the untempered ruckus and crackling disturbance behind him where great winged tumults shrieked in the forefront of aggressing untempered fury in clattering explosions. Sirens blared behind him with a handful of them ringing strangulated blurts of an unnerving sort nearby. One such vehicle convulsing after steamrolling over the pavement and skirting sideways over the corner pavement before readjusting. The driver in a stupor mummified before the vital sign that was his coming unglued attracted attention when, from another incident with a radiator spewing smoke and as liquid formations as though parched lapped at the charred air. The vehicle jackknifing into an abandoned moving truck before persons frantically leapt out of the exploding vehicle, barely making it with their lives. One fleeing vehicle wouldn't escape the terror as a rocket in a terrible impact met head-on with them, fire immediately and wholly engulfing their frantic breathing space. In mind's backdrop and somehow filtering on through toward the lucid forefront of consciousness existed the feeling that being trapped inside of one of these fires was scarcely a greater colossal grim fate for persons still scampering to free themselves, and disheartening it was when many a person at wit's end collapsed to a siege hold inside, emotionally spent and non-violently collapsing in abandon while letting themselves drift into something other than mayhem. One man sinking to the ground by against a utility pole slithering to fall to his backside while sobbing sore. Less than 1 hour later it sounded, still and distant as men judge distance when, was reflected an ominous grumbling airborne disturbance that seemed to be tethered to a collapsible apprehension that just wouldn't unfold. As though surveilling the scene before divesting and from out of the sky crashing down. And, because of the menace descending on VaTiCaN Square, 100 or so fleeing persons aborted plans while thinking downfield in favor of slipping into an off-street refuge place nearby. That hovering menace above wouldn't forever idle in that peculiar repose, in the air, sulfuric and contaminated by the repugnant drift condemning the region and olfactory senses with each passing second, portended a terminal dread that was already touching down and creating an invisible shroud of nest around the escaping persons, in full anticipation of eluding the worst of who for sure knew what it was. Same fleeing persons covering their eyes and noses on a concerted decision turned into a dubious sanctum in an emergency shelter thus far gone unnoticed. As though in full anticipation of the monstrous ball of orange fire that seemed to in its fiery glow descend in sickening slow motion only while beginning to chase away shadows from the scampering throng's facial clefts and bone as many as suppressed breath, impaled by hyperventilation episodes, were final ones, with the atomic blast itself comprised of thousands and thousands of breaths and an unceasing succession of waves of tornadic fury unconstrained by no one certain thing. And, with the fire and liquid pandemonium in other regions of the world resulting in legacy-ending stubble in places neighboring Damascus and Tehran that were, as had they for so long been known as, facilitating places of harbor for terrorist cells and still officially a threat. It was hard to understand how persons on defensive posture there could have made way to places like Italy to brandish a sword of a kind in this offensive move. Persons everywhere in such parts of the world running to the hills and finally appreciating a lull and suspecting in the least bit that they might have to any time soon any organized lethal posture duck. The earth untroubled for a stint in days recent, leaving many persons to believe that finally an attempt on his life had met with success, yet in a sense here he was in menace shape with all of tendril, scale and claw lowering from the sky. The Father Michael Sebastian D'Angelo, like several dozen others, chased out of that shelter with the person against the door pressed hard from the inside and only daring to crack the door open to chase them away. Down stretches full capacity wasn't determined by number of shoulder sets that could together cram in, but by the number of retreating souls who could stack more like sardines, one layer upon another while prone. These would receive beyond maximum capacity in the technical sense, neither of them able to in their Rolodex of patron saints locate the patron saint of weapons of mass destruction, or daring to come up with an interceding saint from the nether region who should answer if this was really the least likely place to search, lest they find that such was the Lord's judgment instead. Turning to a co-intercessor maybe to gap fill for this missing saint in trade for a more reliable one, if a historical version would be available to receive and then own the prayer request. The unnecessary conversation regarding the new travesty from Zechariah passage that immediately does precede Lord's return. The Father D'Angelo, like so many other, clutching dearly to his rosary beads and rattling off his prayers, horrid was the depiction of the face that attested to the horror infinitely more seizing overhead. Throughout our drama the man scarcely ever showing the full whites of his eyes like this, his mouth hung open, drooling as he pray a familiar prayer. Like the exorcist steeped into the steel away while demon chasing, and as though brandishing it like a weapon in front of the eyes of one possessed while shrieking away from that crucifix. The prayer looped and looped, yet that fear, how is it? Painting open his soppy sweaty eyes, as it appeared, and rendering his face as a frothing soup, etching in what alone seemed to anchor instead of the prayer, unconscious to what he in perfect fear ramble, understandable as 'twas on another occasion maybe a clinic for some psychological mind intuition peculiarity. So many others looked away, giving up both the fight and the flight response, sinking inward, and many desperately fell to their knees as that steady whistling sound up there transmuted into a thundering series of boom impregnated with many a seismic crackle as the earthquake only intensified, from thundering chariot wheels transmuting into the supersonic MiG-jets and what might render them the whisper. As though watching an apparition overhead like one reported by the Fatima kids or those in Lourdes, France. As many a dramatic filming of a reenactment might show them while she or her supposed apparition, consume the viewable horizon and transfix her loyal flocking pilgrims something terrible. Each whom appeared to be vainly attempting to liberate from the one he only after for close 2-hour-long periods while staring into the sun reported of seeing. That purple shroud descending ever in front of the sun and without exception seen only where the same could scarcely abet a commodious environment that didn't present risk, as to Elijah's point. Here he was praying what lead the prophet to decry, as though personally affronted and contemning his own dedication unto the Lord. You pray our Father and you do so repetitiously, the lesser offense when you smite thy entire bead's dedication, 'twas what he referred to the string as. By adding a prayer to scarcely the Lord of the Sabbath but to one you would impose over top of the Trinity you purport to teach, the petition scarcely to a historical one but to who you have made the God in place of God. A sacrilege. A blasphemy. A bloody idol. Worship God alone. Repent lest you be left to be overtaken by them. Elijah was livid and boiling over in seething righteous indignation while referring to the souls marked with the mark of infamy. Sebastian D'Angelo, he added the prayer that his tradition demanded even now, Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, from the whole prayer down to repeating only a looping portion of it before only these 9 words with scarcely a space inserted between words became this memory-embedded prayer. He with eyes intense and burning with unkissed tears bleeding down his cheeks heard only strangulated air from his dried-up throat. On a sustaining yet mindless exhale seeping outside of his innermost being when she, the atomic bomb, pierced through Earth's first heaven. An unconscious body emission of that variety that has one under any other circumstance gazing about the room in search of the person breathing what more sounded like a squeal and then low register whistling exhalation. He watched during the eerie quiet before the storm that seemed to swallow up the gross rumble and volume intensifying roar of the bomb before alongside several other people comprising at least 100 souls he, lifelessly staring up there with eyelids peeled back and long after breathing that last breath, was in the throbbing tangent of a shushed riot to swallow up any pulsating taunt from intrepid dread of descending fallout ill-shaped apprehension and inkling of thought of coolest wintry stretches of night stricken sore and swallowed whole. Not one with the earth, but one with the elements. The quantifiable nightmare that he'd thought was unbearable, even after stirring to waking consciousness and far beyond the dream wherein he experienced insufferable heart palpitations. Sure it was terrible but what he couldn't know then was that distant barren land of soot and ash that he walked through in that night terror. It was scarcely far into the distance and out of the picture framery as something that he only from afar in horror gaze upon. Experiencing the rare sight that even the silver screen could in the least bit replicate when attempting to adapt to film a disappearing of a kind. Something opposite of a steal-away rapture that one might have had a heart to smile upon and even after learning to bear the brunt of recollection when seeing oneself as something other than a participating lead protagonist in a play. Living flesh stripped down at the speed of light into nothing unless we describe the closest thing to non-matter when scurrying flesh had in a dash away from bone melted into boot and shoe of all kinds that were left there and filled with the molten substance once hovering o'er top of the same. And how to explain what transpired post-impact if inadequately subscribing in creative ballad definition befitting what loom? If that ghoulish intent was to merely forewarn of this future very real event, then why to underserve like this when one would be hard-pressed to unto near proximity of verisimilitude render the proper description just to fall woefully short of being able to comprehend this grave deplorable thing? In the backdrop of tipping swords and then crashing ceramic animal and historic representative figures of stately decor ornately lining the exterior rooftop of that main artery leading many a heart's affection into her aesthetic bless. Under the tremendous force of it, the quake, 'twas as though the edifice itself announced the quake with the premature shock setting all a-wobble. Forefronting and aligning the upper tier edge of the forefronted statue's roof were the stone figures comprising the 13 statues adorning the facade of St. Peter's Basilica like a dozen and one palace guard centurions, the construct's dedication in November of year 1626, Anno Domini. That's until the structure holding them up beneath their suspenseful tipping, for a moment all of fear and aghast in a few persons thereabouts scampering who'd halted, still the motoring wheels to hone in on the sight feeling harrowing to them as attested in mind's eyes these inebriated 13 wearing the facade like a crown. A score as the tonal Pyrrhic devastation inverted as unscored anthem that drummed over top of the haunting chant that itself was strewn over top of a classical arts rhapsody dirge feeling scarcely triumphant in her worshipper's heart song. Collapsed under such forgetfulness of what loom and lower from overhead as these begin to bring the prophet's words to mind as the falling structure there to support 13 took their cue, as, swear. In an instant retired groundwork following that razor's edge gate wobble her Stonehenge cummerbund aligned with the words. In HONOREMPRINCIPISAPOSTPAVLVSVBVRGHESIVSROMANVS Pont Max and MDCXII Pont 7. Which is, in honor of Prince of Apostles, Paul V, Borghese, Roman, Pontifex Maximus, year 1612, the 7th of his pontificate. Chalk before flames before and visible to the naked eye on scene. The bless of the glossy full-color brochure invitation a distant memory as living flesh was instantaneously stripped down into only the material elements at the speed of light into nothing. Nothing unless we describe the closest thing to non-matter when scurrying flesh had in a dash away from bone melted into boot and shoe of all kinds that were left there and filled with the molten substance once hovering over top of the same. To survive this impact would have been the greater catastrophe, the easiest of a distant fathoming said. And how to explain what transpired post-impact if inadequately subscribing in creative ballad definition befitting what loom. The pain was felt as the fire blossoms approached their targets and 'twas so terrifying that the sight of such was enough to from quite the distance away send the person shielding down below from its blinding radiation heat storm up there into numbing decay when falling victim to the virtual coma for the poor souls. So landed before the fallout could arrange itself in what had stolen someone into the next life where all for them met with resolute end yet 'twas another feat to fathom the unconscionable domain of description itself rendered uninhabitable and flimsy. Heaps of ash and that portion of the Colosseum was the closest one could come to describe the grim barrenness that for several miles rearranged the large acreage radius surrounding like the moat of barren destitution Rome's VaTiCaN. Only to be faulted for under-exaggerating, the prophet hadn't misspoken. Chapter 58.
All right,
Dem
somebody
bones,
called
dem
Ely
bones,
James,
dem, dry bones.
2023.
Dem bones,
Today
dem bones,
is
dem, dry
November
bones.
17th,
Lyrics to the
2024.
joyously bouncy song.
You're listening to the
Joyous
production
because the
titled
bouncy
70.
tune
It'll
is a
be out
prophecy,
in
one
audiobook,
fulfilled years ago when Israel became
ebook,
a nation.
first
The
paperback,
question on our hour, dearest
and
reader on Sojourn.
ultimately,
Is there such
eventually
a
it'll be in
prophecy, left incomplete
hardcover
or serving
release
as
as
symbol
well.
for manifold
It'll be done in
interpretation, or allusion to
2024.
fulfillment in two distinctive
We're
ends?
heading towards
The
the
hand of the
month of
Lord
that.
was upon me, and carried me out in the
Then I'll
spirit
go
of
ahead
the
and work on the publishing, so
Lord,
forth,
and
and the
set me
publishing.
down in the midst of the
Good
valley
day,
which
good
was
night.
full of
Look
bones,
forward
and
to it, and check
caused
back
me to pass by
at
them
Ely
roundabout,
J
and, behold, there were very
for
many in
updates
the open
and
valley,
things
and,
like that.
lo,
So good
they
night,
were very
good
dry.
day.
And he said unto
See
me,
you later.
Son of man,
Come
can
back
these
soon.
bones
All
live?
that.
And I